Good morning and welcome to Net Zero Week's keynote presentations. This morning we're talking about decarbonising industry and commerce and what are the first easy no regret steps that you should be taking on the journey to net zero. We've got a couple of scene setters first, and then, well, we've got three actually. We'll set the scene, frame the debate, and then I do encourage you to ask questions throughout. Use the question pane on the right hand side, and just anything that springs to mind and you want me to put to the panel, then just do use the question panel on the right. And I'll hand over now to James Graham from Smartest Energy, who will enlighten us on what industry and commerce should be looking at in the next 10 to 15 years, heading towards net zero. James, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Are you going to put the slide presentation up?
Yes, I am.
First of all, by way of introduction, my name's James Graham. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing for Smartest Energy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Smartest Energy, we're one of the UK's leading suppliers and purchasers of renewable power. So to be clear on that, we supply renewable power into industrial and commercial businesses. And we also have a large part of our business which is actually entering into power purchase agreements with independent generators, predominantly renewable power, in order to source the power that we sell into our customer base. So we're here to talk to you about some of the no regret first steps in your net zero journey. Tim, if you go on to the first page, please. So I'm sure we're all on the same page about the size of the challenge to reach net zero. To be clear, that's to be able to take out as much carbon as we put into the environment. And this is going to take a fundamental transformation of how we produce and consume energy, how we heat our homes, how we power our transportation. So many aspects of our lifestyle are going to have to change in order to support this critical ambition. So no doubt it's a daunting challenge that we all need to take on, but pleasingly, one that we can see already that governments and many businesses are at least at this stage vocally supporting. Then we've got some press clippings in front of us, the proof points of of how far we've come, at least in terms of making commitments and stating our ambitions. And we're pleased to say that the UK has already brought forward a target to reduce emissions by 78% by 2035. We have large corporates making very public commitments in terms of sourcing 100% of renewable power for their organisations. The RE100 is a collective of these businesses, which is really driving pressure for sustainably focused businesses to make these commitments. There's really been a stream of good news stories about how these net zero commitments are coming from businesses. We're seeing year-on-year growth in demand for corporate PPAs. We've seen a huge amount of businesses securing new corporate PPAs all across the world, in the US, across Europe. We're now seeing a rise of these in other areas such as Asia. And this has really starting to get into the mainstream, whereas the initial focus was large US, particularly the tech giants, and really leading the charge in entering into huge corporate PPAs. But now we're actually seeing interest in demand from all sorts of businesses. We're seeing a lot of manufacturing companies across Europe secure very large and long-term corporate PPAs from renewable technologies. We're also seeing early indications that the public sector and the private sector and large corporates are indicating that they'll put real pressure on their supply chain to decarbonise. And that's going to drive purchasing behaviour, efficiency behaviour right across the piece. We're starting to see proof points in the changing buying habits at a residential level. We're actually seeing a record demand for renewable power tariffs at a residential level. I've seen statistics which show up to 65% of households are now buying their power through renewable tariffs. And this is starting to create a wave of demand and competition for renewable power supply that we've not seen in the UK before. And this is starting to manifest itself in some really positive signals, such as the cost of buying renewable power and the renewable energy guarantees of origin, the certificates that prove the evidence, the source of renewable power. The prices have climbed dramatically. The newspaper clipping says they're 50%, but I think we've seen an even more dramatic climb in the cost of these certificates over the course of the year. And these are really the green shoots that we're seeing. You know, while it's challenging for businesses in terms of increased costs, really in terms of support for the net zero journey and ambitions, these are really positive signs. While there's no doubt this is a huge mountain to climb, it is possible, and we're seeing the National Grid's latest future energy scenarios demonstrating a conceivable future where we're even reaching net zero by 2047, which would require massive coordination of not just renewable power resources, but electrification of transportation and heat, mass adoption of flexible technologies. All of these things need to come together if we're going to hit our targets ahead of time. So, Tim, can we go on to the next slide? So I'm here to talk to you today about some straightforward things that you can do as a business to start fast tracking towards net zero. And one of the most straightforward decisions that you can make is to source 100% renewable power for your organization. Now, that could be done in a number of different ways, whether that's through your energy supplier, whether that's through entering into a corporate power purchase agreement with a generator directly, which could either be for power generation which is connected to one of your sites, or it could be virtually connected by a different sort of structure, or you could be investing directly in your own renewable power resources which you could build and own yourself. These are all legitimate and ways that you could start to report zero emissions relating to your power consumption. So, starting off with the most straightforward thing that you could do, buying renewable power. Now, this could be seen as just a box ticking exercise, that it's not really generating any value. It's not really taking us towards net zero. Well, I would argue quite strongly against that. You know, buying renewable power matters. Now, while this might not be as direct a contribution towards net zero as maybe investing in your own renewable power resources or investing heavily in energy efficiency, it still matters. And why does it matter? It matters because demand creates competition for a resource. Competition for resource creates price signals, and price signals stimulate investment. And we can already see this happening in the UK, whereas previously there's been an abundance of renewable power supply compared to the amount that businesses and homes wanted to buy. We're really starting to see that change. As I mentioned earlier, the demand for residential renewable tariffs is creating real competition and driving up prices. And we've gone from a situation where the renewable energy guarantees of origin certificates, the REGOs, this is how you prove that the power that you buy has come from a renewable source. We've gone from them being a nominal cost, which provided very little price signals to investors in power generation. We can already see as prices start to increase that this could be a real valid source of revenue for renewable power investments in the future. And actually, as we start to get further into our net zero journey and we start to see more demand for renewable power, more competition, these prices could increase and again genuinely start to stimulate investment in new renewable power, which is all bringing down the amount of carbon emissions that we're emitting in the course of power generation. So there is some bad press out there about greenwashing in relation to renewable energy power supply, so it's really important that you know what you're buying and that you can confidently make claims about what you're buying. So that means you need to buy a tariff that you can confidently say has been audited, there's no chance of double counting, and that it can be genuinely validated as coming from renewable sources. So there's many tariffs out there that allow you to do that, including one from Smartest. There's also the ability to go one step further and actually nominate the actual source, the specific generation source, of where you want your power to come from, and ensure that the certificates that come from that power station are directly allocated towards your supply. And this is starting to move towards a kind of gold standard for renewable power tariffs. And again, there is a cost associated with doing this, but the cost that's associated is going back into the businesses that are investing in future renewable power resources, which is it's all taking us towards that net zero ambition. Finally, we're getting into the more complex instruments such as corporate power purchase agreements, CPPAs. These are direct agreements between consumers and generators over a long-term period, and generally the vehicle by which an investor in renewable power would be able to secure sufficient investment to build the project. So typically agreeing a fixed price for, say, 10 to 15 year period, and being able to raise capital off the back of that price commitment. This is going to be a vital instrument for helping more renewable power be developed over time. It's quite a complicated transaction to enter into, but more and more businesses are looking at this as a viable means of securing renewable power for the long term. And then finally, we're on to on-site renewable generation. And again, this is something that many businesses are looking very seriously at. Ultimately, the most effective way and the most efficient way of consuming renewable power is to generate it yourself. You have less power which is lost on the grid, and you know exactly where your power is coming from. However, it's expensive, significant capital investment required to build on site, and there's also practical considerations about do you have sufficient land and the right kind of infrastructure to be able to make these kinds of investments. But there's multiple different ways by which you can secure renewable power, and it just depends where you are as an organisation and what your kind of budgets and what your ambitions are. But there is opportunities there to make your statement and make your contribution to net zero causes. So that was all I was going to talk about today, Tim, if I could hand back to you.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you, James. That was excellent. And we'll pick up on many of those points throughout the discussion, I'm sure. Next up, we have Mervyn Pilley, Director of ESTA. Mervyn, are you online? Can I hear you?
Yes, good morning.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
yes.
Great. I'll hand over to you for a few minutes.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, excellent presentation, James, and full of rich information. Yes, good morning to everyone. In fact, Tim, can you go on to the next slide, please? Because that's obviously just the holding first slide. Yeah, so this is just a personal slide, really, because what was my own personal regret, no regret action in terms of getting businesses, commerce into the net zero phase. And joining ESTA 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago now, and really beginning to understand. I have a retrofit background, so I've been, joined ESTA on the 1st of April 2019. But as I started to have those active discussions with our members, understanding that energy efficiency should be the first step for every organisation on their net zero journey. And obviously what I'm going to go through a little bit is what we're now trying to do, how we're trying to get that up everyone's agenda, certainly in terms of government policy. We've been addressing a range of issues about who is paying for the energy efficiency, how it can be paid for, the best first steps, what our members can support, and also I'll just mention a few collaboration pieces about how we're trying to bring many of membership bodies and many professional bodies into that discussion and debate. Next slide, please, Tim. Very basic bit about myself. I've already mentioned there, I've had a personal retrofit background in the construction sector for a few years, apart from running membership bodies, which has been my sort of main career. Started off as an accountant, very much focused on SME businesses. I would stress I have a passion for SMEs, and obviously one of the first things I did when I joined Esther was got very involved with Philip Hammond's consultation at that point in time when he was Chancellor about SME energy efficiency and how important the government regarded SME energy efficiency as part of the net zero project was, and obviously that's being now reflected by Andrew Griffith's work in terms of trying to get SMEs to sign up to the race to net zero in time for COP. I think there's a risk that the SME community can sometimes get left behind in the debate because obviously generally a lot of people think, well, SMEs don't necessarily own property, they don't actually have responsibility for paying bills, and I disagree with that. In fact, we're targeting and focusing on trying to identify SMEs who actually are energy users, in some cases quite substantial energy users, and working through trade associations to try and create structures where SMEs can effectively create buying groups and effectively buy energy services, potentially funded through energy performance contracts. Personally committed to sustainability and the environment and supporting organisations of all kinds on their net zero journey. Next slide, please, Tim. Esther Basics Energy Services Technology Association, many acronyms out there, just about 35 years in existence. We regard ourselves as the sort of primary, and I would stress we are primarily commercially focused, so our members provide solutions to commerce and business and non-domestic customers. And really that's our mission at the moment, is to reduce energy consumption through the application of technology and the expert services provided by our members. We have a very wide and diverse membership. We have some very large global players in membership and some of the major names in the space. Equally, we have a range of smaller businesses, micro at the consultant side, and certainly we have some manufacturing businesses in our membership and also some installers. And we cover the UK. And in fact, what I would also say is we have started to attract a lot of interest globally, because certainly in our opinion, energy efficiency, clearly net zero is global activity. It's not something in the UK should be trying to do in isolation on its own. So we strongly believe that's part of our mission. Next slide, please, Tim. A little bit about us. Basically, we do try and cover the whole spectrum of energy efficiency. We have the Independent Energy Consultants Group, which is primarily the 50001 ESOS lead assessor groups and SECR reporting consultants. So we have a rank of people doing that work. Interestingly enough, we've just seen two consultations come out, one last week about ESOS and the impact of ESOS. Some discussion. We had a members meeting yesterday which was discussing how that could impact, and one very important thing we believe on that is the recommendations being made mandatory, because there's been a big discussion about ESOS not having the effect it should have, because our members are coming up with lots of recommendations for the businesses they're working for, and then there's many discussions about does it actually happen, and if it doesn't actually happen, then clearly that's not going to have any impact on net zero at all. So the government is talking about making mandatory, but that would probably require legislation, so that could take time to happen. But that first step about ESOS and what's going to happen next has started. We have an automatic monitoring targeting group, which is obviously based around metering, installation and manufacture. Again, discussion yesterday about data, because that's the second consultation that came out from BEIS last week. On that front, is metering there? Should it be improved? And what sort of metering should be installed and where? We have Energy Services Contracting Group. Now we have some quite interesting discussions going on at the moment about energy service contract, energy performance contracting, and how that can be better used. Can it be used to bundle services together, for example, for the SME community, either regionally or within sectors? And some quite innovative approaches going on at the moment about, is it just something that only the major players can take advantage of? And the view is at the moment it's probably not. Linked into that, we've been having some discussions about blockchain and how blockchain can be used for SMEs potentially to sell unused energy from their own production, and can that be linked into an EPC? And that's quite an early stage discussion, but it's certainly there in place. And then the Smart Buildings Group, originally our Building Controls Group, which really is looking at IoT, blockchain, AI, and other technologies that can really ramp up activity in terms of BEMS, BMS BEMS. So yes, we have quite a diverse coverage from within our members, and we think the solutions. I mean, one thing I'm focusing on is the fact that these solutions are all in place. They're lower cost generally, and the quicker payback, certainly in terms of activity, compared with most of the other net zero costs in terms of renewables, EVs, carbon capture storage, most of those big picture stuff, big cost stuff. Energy efficiency clearly should be that first no regret step. Next slide, please, Tim. A little bit about collaboration we're working on, and we're doing some niche, very specific stuff, energy efficiency in buildings group, jointly with Building Engineering and Services Association. We're working with the Public Sector Sustainability Association because there are a lot of public sector bodies have climate emergencies declared and need solutions to get those over the line. We're having a launch meeting later this morning for the Commercial Energy Efficiency Alliance, which is a grouping of trade bodies, professional bodies, both for supplier solution providers and end user organizations, to try and get a comprehensive group of knowledge, information and policy driven focus. Actuate UK, which is a group 8 membership body, building services engineering focused collaboration. We've been asked to support the net zero arm or strand of that grouping. And then Ignite, which is a think tank built around the sustainability development goals, which I'm finding generally can be quite generic, can be quite vague in discussion. So what we're trying to focus on is what we can do now and deliver now can really try and push that agenda forward far quicker. Tim, next slide, please. And then not to forget behaviour change. Yes, we feel strongly that actually, and we've been pushing this message to government, really we strongly support the view that actually energy efficiency is achievable 50% behaviour change, 50% technology. Now that's quite a controversial claim. We have practitioners who've been delivering behaviour change projects with quite large companies for many years, many decades in fact. But the view is that if you take into account the sort of holistic approach to behaviour change, which is it's not just about turning off switching off the lights, it's also about making sure that the technologies that are installed are being used properly, are being programmed properly, and the data that's coming out is being assessed properly. If you include that in the behaviour change mix, then we take that 50% view. We in fact have been bringing case studies together for this energy conscious organisation program. We're just about to do a big research piece with Cranfield University. We're working to a scientific IPMBP protocol measurement to make sure that these savings are verified. We've been convincing government that it's not just wild and woolly science, it is actually tangibly proven savings. And indeed we're quite pleased because actually behaviour change, having been ignored by BEIS for probably quite a long time, they've actually included behaviour change in the ESOS consultation that has just literally come out last week. So that's a step forward. And as you'll see there, we're developing a global training program, practitioners, consultants who can deliver these behaviour change programs at scale to all non-domestic organisations. Tim, next slide, please. And that's just a report that actually we're now looking to actually move that forward and take into account organisations. We've just had our first 2 pilot organisations going through the process. Rolls-Royce is the first pilot company that have signed up to the Energy Conscious as an Energy Conscious organisation, and then we've just taken on a first school, which is a privately owned school, literally only last week. So it's a slow process building new things, but we've been working hard at trying to do that. And we aren't forgetting SMEs. We are also trying to develop a program that can incorporate the SME community into that as well. Next slide, please, Tim. Sorry, this is a slow-moving slide. Too many graphics there. Oh, I think we've lost that slide. That's a simple process. What we're doing for COP, just to allow for the fact that we are trying to drive energy efficiency up everyone's agenda. Obviously, the International Energy Agency put out a report a few weeks ago stressing how important energy efficiency is. We are disappointed at the moment how energy efficiency isn't showing highly on policy, certainly in terms of commercial. Obviously, Green Homes Grant came and went, and we think there'll be a version 2 of that, but we want government to focus on the commercial aspects. As we politely pointed out, we have a Prime Minister who, when he was Mayor of London, actually did talk about coating the whole of the London office blocks with solar panels, which was a project that didn't really quite happen. But we do strongly feel that the commercial aspect of energy efficiency, the non-domestic, needs to be addressed. At COP, what we're doing, we're producing an energy efficiency manifesto for presentation at COP. We're hoping we've got some space at COP to present, and we're also looking to obviously provide that manifesto to document to all of the delegates and really look upon that as a big opportunity. Those are the five underpinning points on that manifesto, which is all pretty straightforward. There's nothing in there that's particularly controversial, except possibly the bit about prioritising energy efficiency measures over support to renewable energy. Tim, I think next slide, which is my last one, I think, just my contact details, I think. Yeah, that's it. So a bit of a whistle-stop through something which has obviously been, energy efficiency is not new. It's been around for a long time. A lot of the solutions are there and accessible now. And we still think that's that first no regret step.
Great. Thank you,
Tim,
Mervyn.
back to you.
Yes, no, thank you. That was very, as you say, very brief, but very interesting. There's a load of things to think about, particularly with things like frameworks like ESOS already in existence, and how to utilise them to gain more leverage on the journey.
The next step, Tim. Yeah, the next step.
We'll go into this in a little more detail just when we hear from the final panellist, Matt Sturgis from the Lighting Industry Association. Matt, can you give an outline of the LIA and their take on the issues?
Sure. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for your overviews of your thoughts. Just, I guess, the Lighting Industry Association. So I've joined as CEO 12th of April. So a little bit about who we are. So we have nearly 300 members in our organisation, but we also have customers that aren't members. And there's sort of four areas that we really operate in. One is technical advice, everything from the ins and outs of lights, how they work, what you need to know in terms of legislation, labelling them, etc. The other area is our laboratory, where we do a range of work in terms of not just photometry, but also a lot of electrical testing for lighting and non-lighting equipment, so IP testing, IK testing, environmental testing, that type of thing, so we can help people validate their products with their design and also ensure that they're compliant to various standards. The other area we operate in is in terms of policy. So we have a range of experts. One of my colleagues here, Bob, is one of those experts that sits on a range of panels in terms of BSI, government panels and things like that. So we keep close to how things are developing and try and nudge the industry in a direction we think will support our members in terms of sort of best practice. And the other areas are our academy. So that's where we support training and development, not only for our members, but also our members' customers to help people understand the legislation, how best to use sort of lighting. So that's a bit about our Lighting Industry Association. To get into, I guess, the topic of the day, there's sort of three areas you could consider. One is energy sources, but that's already been catered for quite eloquently by James in terms of options there. The other area you could consider is the whole area of supply chain, but that's really about making informed choices when you're choosing whichever supplier of lighting systems are. So we get into the crux of it in terms of LED lighting in buildings. So there's a number of steps in terms of how you can get to net zero, some of which businesses are already taking, some of which people are still learning about. I guess the most significant one that most people will know about is the journey in terms of using LED lighting. So there's lots of buildings that are now made that migration to LED. Some are still making that migration. There's still a lot of buildings that are doing that. The next level really is to think about controls. So you can think of it in terms of sort of binary controls, if you like. So historically there's been a lot of controls that are just very simplistic in terms of if there's nobody in the building, they turn the lights off. But increasing, the controls are getting more and more sophisticated, more and more adaptive. So we've now got control systems in place that are actually learning about how the building's used. They're using sensors to work out footfall or where people move in the building. So as and when the building changes in terms of its use, the lighting is adaptive. But there's still things that people can consider. Those lighting control systems also use a certain amount of energy when they're just on standby, parasitic energy use. So there's also improvements that could be made there in terms of how much energy is used by the lighting system when it's sort of in standby mode, if you like. So when thinking about lighting controls as well, the other journey that the technology is going on is making sure we put light where we need it, when we need it. So it's not just about occupancy, but it's also about making sure, so if you're in an office environment, have you got light on your desk? You don't necessarily need the light around you in terms of the sort of gangways if you're not using those at that stage. Life starts to get a little bit more interesting because we've also got a lot of initiatives in terms of circular economy, in terms of how reusable are your lights, how can you upgrade them in the future. And also with human-centric lighting is a big area which is developing. So basically making the lighting inside a building as close as possible to natural light. So there's a number of things that you have to consider when it comes to sort of lighting, and I guess that's where we're trying to help the industry in terms of helping people understand what those choices are, helping to educate, helping to test with those so people can sort of map their journey. So that's just a brief overview of the LIA and some of the steps you could consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks. And do keep questions coming in for the panelists on how to make your first steps towards net zero and what are no regret solutions. James, just an initial one. It's actually something Mervyn was saying. Obviously, the energy efficiency is a no regret, simple, often cheaper way of doing it. And you mentioned on-site generation, and a lot of people like the idea of that because it's very visible and so on compared to energy efficiency. But how can on-site generation, where's the business case for that to make it, to make it financially viable compared to, say, an LED retrofit or installing some sort of CHP or something like that?
I mean, it's quite a complex business case, really, Tim, because first and foremost, it depends on the size and scale of what you're trying to do, but sort of some generic numbers for capex for different technologies. You're talking about maybe as much as £500,000 per megawatt for us for solar, £1 million a megawatt for wind, sort of £400,000 per megawatt for battery storage. These are huge amounts of money, particularly if you're looking to take yourself completely off grid. And then there's the obvious challenge around renewable technologies being intermittent as well. So you still effectively need to be able to be connected to the grid or to have battery storage on site. But actually, so looking at the long term, it's weighing up what are the costs of power going to be over a long-term period. These are assets with a long-term life. These are assets which allow you to become less reliant on grid power, so de-risk some of the increases in costs that you can see either in wholesale commodity prices or increasing costs of what we call non-commodity prices, the costs of using the transmission and distribution system, and the cost of renewable levies and taxes. So it is a really complicated business case, and you've got to add in the fact that you have to have confidence that your operations are going to be on the same site and using the same amount of power for a long-term period as well. So throw all that into the mix, and there's a really strong business case for some types of organizations who have that kind of long-term investment cycle, who have access to low-cost capital. There's a really powerful business case there. For other businesses, it just won't work, and it won't make sense. And for some businesses, it all makes sense to do it at a kind of smaller scale, because there'll be natural constraints around the kind of size of the site, the infrastructure. There are just natural constraints you have to consider with investments in renewable power. But in terms of the journey to net zero, if you're committed on that journey, then this could be a viable investment for you in some way, shape or form.
Are you noticing, because of the net zero push and the fact that it's taken hold at board level and in the general public's awareness, are people maybe making commitments for longer terms and doing not so demanding paybacks in only a couple of years and that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. So whether you're making a commitment in terms of renewable power on-site generation, whether you're entering into a corporate power purchase agreement, these are commitments to supporting low carbon generation over a long-term period, and these aren't investments that give you quick paybacks. You are talking these are long-term investments, so these are investments that committed businesses are making.
So you have noticed it actually changing?
Yeah, certainly. I would say the growth in corporate power purchase agreements is one of the big indicators, because it is quite challenging sometimes to build the kind of scale of renewable power on your site. So these businesses are naturally looking at other options, and CPPAs, directly do support the growth of power generation, albeit maybe not connected directly to your operations. And this is, we're seeing press clippings, month after month of new transactions that have gone through in the UK and in Europe. It's really gathering pace.
Just whilst we're on that, actually, Mervyn and Matt, what are you noticing people being less demanding on payback periods perhaps than they used to be because of the net zero drive?
I think it's still very important to people. I guess people are either thinking about short-term sort of payback 2 to 3 years, or they're thinking about the longevity of a building they might wish to light, and how that building use might change. So I think it tends to be either a payback thought or a very long-term view about how that building's going to develop. And I guess it depends whether you own the building or whether you lease it, etc.
Absolutely.
Just to add into that, the other thing obviously at the moment is with the pandemic situation and with the businesses drastically, James's point about long-term property usage is clearly at the moment very much up for grabs, because a lot of major corporates are seriously considering, certainly in terms of offices. I appreciate it's different from manufacturers, because manufacturing clearly isn't likely to be shutting. They've been going throughout the pandemic, but certainly some of the bigger office blocks and some of the major retail shops and areas like that are clearly changing quite quickly. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to add into the mix with this about payback, of course, is what's all equally frustrating, or is quite bizarre, is the tax system. I'm an accountant by background. I'm a huge believer in carrots and sticks, and you've either got to do it through legislation for the sticks, but really, where are the carrots now? Interestingly, obviously from an incentivisation for tax relief perspective on CapEx, having pulled the enhanced capital allowances scheme for businesses back in April 2020 for buying energy efficiency equipment on the energy technology list, which was quite bizarre, and everyone said at the time, is this the right time to be doing that sort of, at the very time you want businesses to invest in energy efficiency equipment. It seemed bizarre then to take that relief away. And then obviously in this year's budget, the Chancellor suddenly brought in this super allowance, 130%, but of course that's any CapEx, that's not energy efficiency specific. So it's just saying to businesses, if you go and buy anything that's capital for you, then you'll get the relief. So it's using those incentives, and payback to me as an accountant obviously should build in the tax relief aspect of that, because if you're only getting your normal 25% capital allowance on your CapEx, then that's in itself extends that payback period. But yes, it's obviously very difficult, because each business is going to have a very separate standalone view on payback, what's relevant to their business.
Away from that simple ROI payback into a more total cost of ownership, and taking on board, because they're making the climate emergency and the declarations on that side. But
yeah, I think the other thing I'd say on that,
actually maybe more long-term plans is what I meant. Yeah,
I think the trouble is, of course, with the 2050 target date, that in itself is encouraging. Perhaps is that not helping the situation? I don't know. And then you've got the 2035, the 78% target now for 2035. I think there's so many different targets flying around that doesn't help businesses either, because they're not quite sure what target date they're planning for, in terms of their own payback period measured against their net zero aims, their net zero targets.
If I can chip in on paybacks, and the lighting industry has been the poster child for low energy, LEDification, achieving great paybacks. The danger you can have is if you're focusing purely on payback, you can miss lighting quality. And let's face it, we deliver lighting normally for lighting for people. So you can have short-termism. We were talking about the long-term effects of the building. We need to understand embodied versus operational carbon, life cycle carbon, circular economy, where how long your product's going to be in use, etc., etc., etc. So we can deliver quick paybacks. To a certain extent, we've already done that. The interesting one for us is how to go to next generation of energy saving and still deliver lighting fit for people. And this gets really, really interesting.
To your knowledge, are people focused on where the things come from, its miles and the embedded carbon in products? Are they actually requesting that currently?
If you actually, in terms of lighting, I think it varies with where you're manufacturing your product, where your supply chain is. The operational carbon is still hugely more important than your embodied carbon, but it is a life cycle.
I think it also depends on what the corporate policy of a particular organisation is. So if their corporate policy is very much about the environment, then they're going to make possibly more long-term decisions. Also, if they are concerned about human-centric lighting and the effects it has, particularly, say, in an education environment, there's lots of studies that show improvements in studying, then they're going to take a long-term view. So I think it very much depends on the type of business in terms of what decisions they're making. But it's probably fair to say there's a migration more away from ROI, but that's probably a slow migration, I think.
I remember back at the beginning of LEDs, I walked into a shop and they said, I've been recommended to change all my lighting to LED. And this really was Gen 1. I said, great, but you'll go broke. He said, why? I said, well, because Gen 1 LED in those days was fairly blue, fairly terrible, fairly dim. I said, it'll save you lots of energy, but your customers won't be able to see the product. You won't sell it. Now, what we have to do is use the minimum possible. So let's look at the 4 key concepts of achieving a net zero building. It's reduce, that's where we are. It's offsetting and residual, it's think local, and it's embodied versus operational. We're very much firmly on the reduce, but we also have to look at the corporate objectives of the organization. And that, as Matt said, that could be a school. Their objective is to get maximum educational attainment out from their children. A hospital, it's wellness. So it's blending that.
I've got a question coming through here for Mervyn, actually. I think you touched on this, but it just says that it's about the ESOS consultation currently underway. And one of the considerations is to expand the scope to include medium-sized businesses. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very much a yes. We certainly wouldn't be unhappy with ESOS being extended. I mean, obviously there is a cost implication for businesses to comply with ESOS in terms of employing consultants, and obviously there is a cost with consultants. But at the end of the day, I think my answer to that would be it depends very much on what happens to the results, what recommendations, and also in terms of extending out to scope 3 emissions. It's a broad debate. I mean, I think businesses are very sensitive about reporting. I've done it from the other end. I've worked in a company where we had to have audits. We ended up with recommendations for different reasons, for planning reasons, because of some of the size issues that James was talking about. We couldn't implement some of those practical reasons, so we couldn't implement. So we paid the consultancy fees to have that audit done. And I think that's the trouble with business. They tend to be quite cautious about having to pay for consultants to produce a report. So I think the important thing for ESOS is the government's got to make that decision. Is it going to mandate recommendations to be implemented? And if it isn't, then I think there's concern amongst certainly my members in the consultant sectors that reality is that it's not going to help really net zero, because it's so many different business psychological issues about businesses implementing, and there's already been said, why would a business, I mean, the major debate at the moment in terms of the public's private ownership, the houses and so on, why didn't the public take more active interest in what was going on with Green Homes Grant? And the business, whilst businesses obviously are coming from a very different angle, there's not that much difference in the psychology of a business owner or a board of directors as to why are they doing this? Why would they take these steps? If they have to do something because they're told they have to do something, they have to have an SECR, they have to have an ESOS audit, then they have to. But I think there needs to be some, if they're going to mandate it, and I think the view at the moment, certainly from the consultant's view, is they probably should mandate it, but then businesses will expect potentially something back, to my mind, in terms of tax relief or investment relief or VAT. There are different taxation ways of incentivizing some of those actions. It's very early. I mean, to be fair, the consultation literally came out on the 5th of July, so it's literally only been out, and it's got a late response date. It's back not to the end of September, which is unusually long for a government consultation. I think it's probably allowing for the fact that the government are obviously in recess. I actually managed to say yesterday the government in recession, which I obviously didn't mean, the government in recess, and then obviously with holiday periods and so on. So it's a long consultation period. But yeah, I think ESOS is considered a good thing. Obviously, our members would say that, the consultant members, because they're earning money from that process. But they do accept that what doesn't happen at the other end is very, very important from a net zero perspective, an energy efficiency perspective.
So one of the first steps, obviously, people would take is energy efficiency and looking at things. I mean, if they're not sure where to go or what to do, I mean, actually, is also what James said, is buying renewably. It seems a no-brainer. You may as well do that. And then if you don't know where to go, are you saying things like if there's large enough in ESOS, or maybe they should go for 50,001 even if they're not within it? These would be just a great source, even if you haven't acted on any of it, because it was just sitting there waiting to, with recommendations to move towards reduced consumption.
We're trying to take that step further, because we're agnostic. As obviously as a trade association, we have some responsibility to our members to try and make sure that their solutions are the ones that generally get in front of the consumer, the customer. But reality check, in this type of market, we have to accept that the solution, I mean, we're discussing the energy technology list, which I don't know, it's been in existence for quite a long time. The government fundamentally changed it last year. And basically they've accepted that what was basically is now pretty much a compare the market website on a government website, on the .gov website. Originally it was under HMRC's control, because it was basically there that only the equipment that was purchased on that list would qualify for tax relief. So it was really the accountants who were using the lists and the HMRC. The government said, no, let's have an energy technology list that is all about signposting the most energy efficiency equipment to business, to customers, consumers. But reality check, we were shocked yesterday, because we had throughout last year, we were consulting about the aspects of the energy technology list that were clearly flawed. For example, software as a service is not on the list. So you've just got all sorts of equipment, hand dryers. You'd be amazed. I think it's about 40,000 different products on the ETL. We're driven now, and this is one of the reasons we're pushing, and we're also building an end user information hub for commercial non-domestic users, hopefully with an interface to the ETL, because unless you have a PhD in energy management, or you employ a PhD in energy management or a full-time energy manager, you're not going to be easily be able to find the solutions to energy efficiency that you want through the ETL at the moment. That's not going to happen, because you'd be bamboozled by the sheer weight of data that is on there about hand dryers, and including embodied carbon. There's a whole discussion point about the data that's on the ETL. And of course, some sectors, I think lighting, there was a whole discussion about some sectors are not actually on the energy technology list, which in itself was a major challenge if you're looking for solutions. So we're trying to build an agnostic, non-ESTA focused solution hub for all non-domestic commercial users. And it's also the reason for the Commercial Energy Efficiency Alliance to try and provide resources for all businesses, all non-domestic, all users across the piece to help get solutions in place as fast as possible, because we haven't got a lot of time.
No, absolutely. James, you were is there anything in that equivalent to what Mervyn was just saying, if you're thinking of maybe on-site renewables and things like that? Is there any, which one do I choose? There's a plethora equally of, PVs, wind turbines and so on, or even if you're going PPAs, where do I start? How do I choose? Is there any recommendations and lists you can access in that way of best practice?
I'm not that I'm aware of, but Mervyn might be aware of something. But I mean, because you're talking about such a huge amount of capital to invest, this is something you will need to take very seriously, and you will need to engage experts to make the kind of assessment about what the optimal technology would be for your particular site, particularly when we're talking about on-site generation. When we're talking about corporate PPAs, it's you could argue it's a bit more of a commercial decision. Effectively, if we're talking about a corporate PPA where you're not actually physically connecting to the source of the power, then it is more of a commercial arrangement, and then it's really around it's a choice, it's a preference. If your organisation supports a particular type of technology for a particular reason, and it's also about the kind of getting the best possible commercial arrangement, because you are effectively entering into agreement to buy a commodity over a long-term, uncertain period. So it's very, very important that you're able to accurately assess whether that represents good value for your business or not. It's a critically important buying decision. It's tough enough trying to decide how to buy your power for a year ahead, never mind 10 to 15 years ahead. So and this is why, relatively speaking, whilst it's certainly growing pace, there's still a lot of people buy via renewable tariffs rather than corporate PPAs because of the complexity required.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It just seems it's so complex. There's complex legal document, need lawyers involved and things. Why should they bother with that? What's the subtle differences between when I can just go and buy green straight from my supplier today?
Yeah, I mean, it is a large undertaking. There is a lot of experienced law firms and consultancies now, though, that can assist companies quite efficiently with going through this transaction process and help them effectively make an informed choice. But there is obviously a cost involved in doing that. But the big difference is a corporate PPA is securing your supply of renewable power from a designated source, a specific source, for a fixed price or an agreed price mechanism over a period of time, thereby taking all of that volatility out about what happens over that period of time. Now, whereas a choice to buy power through a renewable tariff is a short-term decision. It gives you effectively what you need for a particular period of time. But what we're seeing already is a huge amount of volatility, and there's this really fascinating change of supply demand balance, which has happened really, really quickly. As 50% of UK consumption comes from the household, 50% comes from businesses, and actually we're starting to see more and more households opt for renewable tariffs, and suppliers are forced to go and source renewable power in ever-growing quantities, and this is actually now driving competition for renewable power supply businesses versus that household. And it's gone from being in some cases free, zero cost, everybody was going to opt for renewable power, it costs nothing, to all of a sudden it's a tangible cost that everybody wants to be able to say, does that represent value or not? So in one sense, you can go out, you can buy a tariff for a year or two. At the end of those 2 years, you could be facing costs which could be significantly higher than you were paying previously. Whereas under a corporate PPA, you've got stability in your revenues and your cost over a longer term period. However, anything can happen over that longer term period as well. So it's a challenging decision. And what we would generally see is, rather than it being a binary decision, I'm going to do 100% of my power from a corporate power purchase agreement, you tend to say, I'll source part of my power from a CPPA, and effectively diversify the kind of risk of one means of buying renewable power over another. But I sort of don't underestimate the challenge in making those decisions. But we can say confidently, more and more businesses are investing the time to assess whether that's the right option for their business or not.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here for Matt on fluorescent lighting is set to be banned at some time in the future. As T5 lightings can be just as efficient and in some cases more efficient than LED fittings, is it sensible to ban very efficient T5 lighting and replace with LED?
Well, I guess the first thing is, I guess we've all got to abide by the law. I guess that decision's been made for us, really. But it depends what your starting point is in terms of technology, in terms of how much energy you're going to save. But it's still fair to say, in general, if you're making the move to LED, you're going to make a significant saving in energy.
I think we obviously saw T12 fluorescent, taken out a long time ago because that had whole-star switchcar gear. T8 were then the next ones to follow. We have to remember with T5, there's still mercury in it, so it's toxic waste. I fully understand that the well-designed T5 luminaire can deliver a good scheme if it's on it has to be on high-frequency gear. If it's got controls, it's not the worst out there. So I would look at other spaces on a, say, university campus to replace first. And don't forget, if you've got installed fittings, that doesn't mean you have to take them out. We're just saying that we can't be selling anymore. So that's important to understand. It's a journey, and I would always advocate we go for the lowest ones, the worst energy efficiency or the most toxic waste generating products first.
Absolutely. There's another one here that says, I've been involved with retrofit building management systems which have resulted in energy consumption increases, and because they are accessible online, building occupiers have not been able to address the issues on site. Isn't there a danger that some building management systems do the opposite of what is intended and increase energy use? Isn't it better to use local controls which can be maintained by a wide scope of engineers and not locked to one business?
Shall we take that from a lighting point of view?
Yes, not specifically aimed at anyone. So yeah.
If we'd all gone for a walk around London before COVID, we would have seen many office buildings with the lights burning. So much so that the City of London has managed to dim its street lighting predicated on the fact that there's spill light coming from the highly glazed office buildings around it. Now, actually, I think that's kind of clever because actually that's using borrowed light. But nearly every single one of those buildings had lighting controls installed. So earlier on, at the top of this webinar, we were talking about behavior change. It's super important. Any of you guys managed to get your kids to turn the lights off? There's all sorts of things we need to do to get people to understand controls. There's also a journey of controls in actual fact that to make controls usable. Who stayed in a hotel room where you can't work it out to turn off that last light fitting when you want to go to bed? Here, we're both Matt and I are relatively new to the organisation. We're still trying to fathom how to use some of the controls because every single space has a different control scenario. We have to remember the fundamental connection of controls is the human. We also have to remember that the people in the space enjoy controls and control over their environment. If we can teach them why we're saving energy, what we're trying to do, they can have it all. They can have the no-grid controls. And they can also tailor the space to what they want to do. You should know one thing. Let's look at RIBA. Let's look at the stages of design, RIBA stages of design. The last stage is go back and learn. How many people went back to their last building and checked whether it did what it was going to say they were going to do? And if needs be, it's all part of commissioning, which is often badly done. SIBSI soft landings. Let's get on with it. Let's do it. Handovers. Let's look at the new building safety regulations coming out and the golden thread. Let's go back, almost building MOTs. This is going to improve.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking for you, Mervyn, on the behavioural change is you were saying it's verified? You're getting it verified. Was it for the MVPA?
No, it's the International Protocol for Measurement and Verification, which is a US. It's a standard. It's a recognised standard for measurement and verification. Because
I thought in the past they schemes that everyone gets excited. There's an energy champion. It all have a nice meeting and we do things, and then it all drifts back, or at least drifts back somewhat. And so making it persist always seemed to be the problem.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, Tim. There's got to be said straight away that no, you can't do it that way. It's got to be what we're going a holistic approach, because there's so many interventions, and I'm not the technical expert, so I'm not going to start trying to describe them. But I'm sure there's about 140 different interventions in that behaviour change programme. And yes, internal, external. So internal from the Energy Champions perspective and keeping the staff engaged, everyone engaged in what's going on, bottom up rather than top down, although the top have got to agree to what they're doing and the reasons behind it. No, the protocol I was mentioning was only really to convince, as I said earlier, the government that this isn't some sort of wild and woolly science that, which I think, to be honest, we were shocked because, and funny enough that Matt's colleague there mentioned about the lights on, because we actually offered bays at 1 Victoria Street. We had some photographs of 1 Victoria Street, which is, those of you who know, Bayes' office is a very substantial building in just close to the House of Commons. And we had pictures with lit up like the fairy Christmas tree in the middle of the night, when clearly there weren't any Bayes civil servants in that building. We did actually offer them free of charge a behaviour change programme implementation to prove to them that actually what we were saying was valid and true and could be done. And regrettably, that got buried in various, I think the Government Property Agency and a few others said, no, that's our responsibility, that's nothing to do with Bayes. So we never got that off the ground. But yeah, the measurement side of it was very important, because we said, no, these are scientifically proven and measured savings. So this isn't just someone saying, oh, well, if you do that, that's going to save that. We actually, the case studies we're building case studies slowly, but we are building them. And the important thing for us is that those are measured savings, so that it's not just someone just saying, well, of course. And actually, you're right, Tim, most important thing is continual. It's not just something you can just start and that's it and say to everyone, hey guys, we want you to do this. And then a couple of years later say, oh, by the way, what happened? Interesting enough, obviously, going back and again reviewing savings is important, and absolutely yes, there's no point in just implementing and starting and then 2 or 3 years down the line forgetting and saying, well, when did that ever happen, what happened? So yeah, so what our consultants tend to want to do is to go back later on in the process, even if they're only on that fixed contract to do the program initially. They will often just go back in and check and say, are things working, and can we have a look at the figures? It's a continual process. Absolutely, behaviour change by definition is a continual human process. It's not a one-off.
James, could you touch on and anyone else can come in on this, but I just thought, James, initially, is where flexibility and time of use strategies fit into net zero journey. So you've got your energy efficiency, you've got your renewables and low carbon gen. So where's this? Will it be used a lot, or is it just a peripheral activity?
I think it's, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, forward energy scenarios have some optimistic scenarios where we can hit net zero significantly early. But for that to happen, there has to be some sort of investment in flexibility, whether it's through utility scale storage, whether it's through wide-scale adoption of EVs and vehicle-to-grid optimization, or demand-side response. We've seen businesses kind of struggle to adapt to demand-side response. Maybe the price signals that haven't been significant enough for a lot of businesses to really invest, or it's just been technically too much of a challenge and with too many operational impacts. So it's naturally seeming that new technology, storage technology, whether that's say part of a discrete battery storage installation, or whether it's the batteries in your electric vehicles, that would look like it will be the most likely source of flexibility going forward. And in order to decarbonise, the amount of renewables that we'll need on the grid is huge. It will effectively have to overbuild capacity to make sure that we've always got sufficient power within the UK, which means at points in time that there will be an inherent storage issue effectively. And either that's going to get filled by interconnectors, so allowing a free flow of power through renewable power through connected European countries, or it's going to be a problem of storage. And we haven't really, the National Grid paints a number of different scenarios where it could be that green hydrogen plays a much bigger part, and the ability to effectively store energy, or it could be battery storage, or it could be a combination of all of these technologies. These are all going to be vitally important.
Can I just add, I think this came up from our members meeting yesterday, the debate about the storage side and the fact that capacity to create that storage capacity, and also the precious metals debate about how is that capacity going to be created and what impact on the environment is that going to have. I suppose it's a similar discussion about installation of heat pumps. Is there a capacity in the UK to create enough battery storage capacity for the businesses to be able to create that, what they need? And that's a concern, because I don't think that, I agree, storage logic is probably easier to put in than the demand side response aspect, but yeah, there's a big debate about whether or not we can get up to speed with that storage requirement, and especially if we're going to be getting the metals that go into those batteries from mines in Africa and other places where clearly it's not a very good scenario. It's the price we're all paying for net zero, which I think tends to be forgotten on the commercial side. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on it in terms of fuel poverty and the individuals, but there's a price to pay for businesses for net zero as well that needs to be remembered.
Yeah,
absolutely. If I can chip in on that point, I think that's where we also need to address circular economy. Mm-hmm. If we have this take, make, waste, the linear economy of product to address net zero, we've got more problems. We have to understand full circularity. We've got some limited resources in the key components, some of the conflict minerals. We need to understand that. To keep back on the theme of flexibility, interestingly, modern lighting, we can now be infinitely more flexible than we ever were. We can deliver changes of color temperature. We can give circadian lighting. But also an interesting one is, many of you are now watching this from home. You went home without a light meter, and you worked from home, and probably many of you didn't die. Now, interestingly, we have the option, the ultimate variable outside is we have daylight. And, nobody, with lots of clients saying we have to deliver 400 lux to every single desktop, or in actual fact, we want 400 lux delivered to every corner of the office floor. Hey, if we can understand the variability of daylight, and then we top up with the artificial lighting, all sorts of interesting things happen on variability. That's variability across the floor plate of an office and variability through day. And we need to accept that. Because actually, humans like it. Just sitting you all in a constantly lit space with, we said it was acoustics and light and heat. Well, that's a bit like being put in an isolation cell in prison.
Yes, and do you have any figures on the sort of what you could shave off by changing colour, temperature, or something like that?
Well,
changing temperature.
Actually, if you have circadian lighting, you actually increase your installed load because you're now going to have 2 different channels of lighting, but you don't actually ever use more. So in terms of build energy management, we need to understand between installed load and predicted maximum in-use mode. But I was going to shock you on daylight. Today we're up in Telford, it's fairly grey outside, and if I went out there with calibrated light meter, I'm probably getting 30,000 lux outside. Now, you only need, a few hundred on your desk. If you're older like me, you probably want a bit more than that. So, by using daylighting in highly glazed buildings, we need to understand that solar energy is now a heat source and it's got to remove using air conditioning, etc., etc. But this is part of the whole building design that we need to achieve. But how many times do you think where people have just pulled all the blinds and they never open them again? No, so let's look at some of the, some of the lighting controls manufacturers. One of the big energy saves they get is from automatically closing the curtains on, the sun-facing rooms in hotels, so the air condition, so you're not building up solar gain during the day. And yet, all the possibilities of building controls and smart use of enabling us to have a better life without and it being no regrets, as this is headed up, as superb. Yes. It just needs that bit more thought.
So there's huge possibilities, I guess, with flexibility, as Bob said, with circular economy, really, in adaptive controls. There's a lot you can build into systems to have that flexibility in the future.
That's great. I mean, there's how do you think it moves on to, are people actually got the net zero sort of plan in their head? Have you got any evidence for that, either of you, in the sense of they're actually looking towards 2050, they're looking, they've got steps to make, they understand maybe scope 1, 2 and 3 and that sort of thing, or is that all too advanced?
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm not sorry, when you say scope, they understand scope 1, 2 and 3, Tim. I think scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 is by far the harder one to deal with.
Only you've done it, but you've got a plan to maybe by 2030 you'll have done it or something.
Even the plan for scope 3, I think, is the harder step than scope 1 and 2. I think, to be honest with you, at the moment, just the sheer challenge. Everyone obviously is focused on COP, and businesses are all being urged by Andrew Griffith and others to sign up to Race to Net Zero at speed. The big concern, as I pointed out to Bays a few times, is, well, COP surely is just an event. It's just the start of a very long journey, or it needs to be quite a quick journey, but a big intention. And I'm not convinced that enough. That one of the problems of the collaboration front is there are vast numbers of collaborations out there trying to create the business ability for businesses to be able to plot, plan, and deliver net zero. But the reality on the ground is, for the businesses themselves, I suspect, is that still far too many businesses, even if they've signed up and ticked a box, have they actually really addressed net zero properly, including all the aspects, the circular aspect, circular economy aspect, certainly. There's just so, and of course, to be fair, businesses have been hit by Brexit, they've been hit by a pandemic, and it's just so much going on. The businesses are just looking to concentrate on staying in business. So have they got net zero plans in their heads? Well, they might have them in their heads. Where they've got beyond actually in paper and practical terms, probably not. There will be exceptions, and of course there'll be major corporates out there who have certainly got all their plans in a row, because they've got the very expensive consultants who go along and say, this is how you do it every step of the way, and handheld and so on. But a substantial number of UK businesses, I suspect, are very far off the mark.
I would agree with that. I think probably most businesses, if they at least feel that they're making some progress towards it, and they've got some plans, then that's probably the level of comfort that they're at this stage. But I would agree that in terms of comprehensive plans to net zero, is probably more likely that the larger corporations. And it's even a challenge for them, I guess, to get their heads around all the different options and the different choices and legislation.
Partly policy driven as well. I think that's back to what we were saying earlier, because the net zero strategy hasn't come out, the heat and building strategy hasn't come out yet.
Yeah.
And how can businesses plan when they don't know quite what the law might be? And the prices, because James, you were talking about pricing. A big discussion yesterday about, is there going to be a tax on gas? There's going to be a gas levy. Should we be taking the electricity levies off? Because obviously of fuel poverty issues for individuals should be, so much loaded onto the electricity price in terms of paying for all sorts of different previous schemes. So price certainty. So there's no price certainty. There's no policy certainty. It's very hard for businesses to look over the top of all that and say, oh, by the way, yes, of course we're going to do all these things in stages over the next 5 years, 3 years, whatever the targets are. And as I say, back to what I said earlier, 2050 and 2030, we've gone from everyone focusing on 2050 and all of a sudden a big announcement last, 78% by 2035. And to me, that doesn't help business, because, that's an incredibly dramatic change, especially when in a backdrop where you just don't have that certainty on pricing or on policy.
Well, I think that's reflected by the Energy Institute survey that came out this week. That 80% thinks we're not actually going to do net zero by 20.
Well, that's the energy professionals said that. That survey that's the energy. Anyone working in the energy space, we don't feel. The professionals don't feel that. So how can the businesses who aren't professionals? Where are they coming from? And I'm saying, I suspect that's the biggest single challenge, is the gap between business on the ground. And I've run businesses, I've owned businesses, I've been at the other end of it all and outside of the energy space. And yeah, I can remember so many other policies in the past where you focused on doing things and trying to get things sorted out. And you just need that certainty of price, you need that certainty of policy and law. So you need to know exactly what you've got to do when, and if you don't do it, what you're going to get fined or what penalties are. Or if you're going to invest in something, are you going to get that tax relief? Or are you, if you're paying for something, one of the single biggest disincentives, of course, for energy efficiency has been price rises, because as fast as businesses are investing in energy efficiency, if the finance director is signing off continually bigger electricity energy bills, that's not an incentive, that's a disincentive. They can't see any benefit. So if I was a finance director, I'd be saying, well, why are we doing this? We're still paying out more and more money for our energy. We're not really, where is the benefit? And if it's just to deliver a net zero target, that's a massive gulf. And I think businesses need to be educated better about net zero as well. But that's a separate point. That's something obviously trade bodies can deal with. Sectors can help, deal with that.
I think in the commercial industry, I think there's also another way of looking at that. That lighting is now already delivering well past Part L of the building regulations. But there's voluntary codes, there's BREEAM, there's LEED, there's WELL 2, there's, we're probably going to be coming out with an industry voluntary circular economy assessment method, where we'll be in front of UK European legislation. Now, typically, we're beginning to find that a building which is seen to be green will let quicker than the building which isn't. And therefore, major developers are realizing they have to build green. So we have voluntary codes which they're signing up to.
But it's interesting though, Bob, because obviously one of the early questions was about retrofit, and obviously we've got to allow for the fact that the vast majority of commercial premises are not being built. They're going to be, in fact, I suspect, I'm not sure who is still building commercial property. Well, some people are, but I'm not actually sure why or when. But certainly in terms of retrofit side of things, that's fairly important. I agree.
Absolutely. If you look at the RIPA report, I think came out last week, they said you really don't want to take down the structure because the embodied energy in the concrete. So let's look at facade and let's look at building services.
Yeah,
it's the ultimate retrofit solution.
Yeah, and retrofit, I see again, commercial retrofit has had so little attention, so little focus. It's probably because every single the view is obviously that every business premises are going to be radically different from every other business premise.
Yeah.
Unlike people's homes, which tend to be fairly box-like and have certain things, but whereas businesses not. But still, that retrofit focus in commercial terms has not had that address, that attention addressed to it. Lighting has been obviously LED has been a very quick win for a lot of businesses. Unfortunately, that hasn't been replicated in some of the other solutions that would fit into retrofit. We're still dithering around PAS 2038 1 and 2. I think it might be getting a bit closer, but the PAS situation, and I know PAS because I was involved with PAS 2030 in very early days, and that's been another challenge for businesses in terms of retrofit and how that retrofit's carried out and where the installers are to do the retrofit. Are there enough installers? Not much different to the argument about the Green Homes Grant. I'm sorry, I apologize. You'll have gathered I'm a bit of a soapbox, but to me, these things are they're not joined up. And if you're trying to address these things as a nation, for the business community, it's frustrating.
A very confusing landscape for people trying to make informed choices and decisions, isn't it?
I think so. That's the single problem for me. I mean, and all the collaborations are working hard to try and pull this stuff together. And I'm not blaming the trade bodies or the professional bodies or businesses. It's just we need the leadership to really, and as I can't focus, I know that with COP, and I keep on about COP, but to not have a net zero strategy and a heat and building strategy this close to COP, you just can't feel the leadership is quite coming down and saying, look, this is what you've got to do. This is really what we recommend. Hydrogen, we've had a discussion about hydrogen, obviously that came up earlier. Again, quite what the policy is going to be on that, how that's going to fit. We know what BEIS are talking about with hydrogen, but where's that going to fit for business? Is there and the heavy trucks, fuel cell vehicle technology against EV? I mean, there's a lot of debate still going on in some of those areas. Businesses are going to be confused if they're not really sure which technology to back and which policies which technology the government is suggesting that they use.
James, in contrast to this, you were saying about hitting the target earlier, whereas we're talking about not hitting it potentially. But
no, I'm not saying we wouldn't hit it. I'm just nervous. Yeah.
No, I was saying like the Energy Institute had a thing where 8 out of 10 thought we wouldn't hit it. So yeah, but the 2047 you were saying and things. What study was that?
That's the National Grid's future energy scenarios. So, I mean, that's why you have scenarios. They range from the less optimistic right through to the highly optimistic.
Yes, okay. I've got a question here, actually, back to flexibility. It says the government estimate 10 billion a year can be saved with embedded flexibility. What is the true value of embedded storage at the grid edge, and when will it be realised?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question to answer, but there's been a massive growth in battery storage, at least in the last few years. It's still pretty brave capital that's putting money into battery storage. So the growth in renewables in the UK was off the back of long-term government subsidies, which are being recovered through energy consumers. There's nothing equivalent in place for battery storage. So it attracts a different sort of investor, but it's still happening. But at the moment, the big value the battery storage is providing is grid frequency services, effectively, which are partly a function of increasing penetration of renewable generation and big volatility in voltage. But I mean, that's where the battery technology comes into its own, to be able to provide sub-second response for major changes in frequency in the transmission system. So recovering for big drops in voltage where power stations are tripping off. That battery storage is perfect for those kinds of issues. But as we get deeper into it, it's not just going to be about grid frequency services. It is going to be about storage of energy for prolonged periods of time. We're talking about, we have a lot of seasonal load, and if we start to move towards electrification of heat, again, we're going to have a much bigger disparity between summer power usage and winter power usage, and we also have a disparity in when power is produced. There'll be a lot more renewable power produced in the summer than the winter, and there is the fundamental problem of long-term storage, which batteries don't really solve that problem.
I mean, what are long-term solutions? And we're talking things like, I mean, there is pumped hydro and things, but there's not enough of that.
Well, I guess look to things like the announcement by Centrica of converting rough storage into a huge storage facility for hydrogen in the long term. It's these kinds of developments where energy can be stored for much longer durations and provided flexibly as and when needed. But these are infrastructure of giant proportions that is needed to support that.
We're approaching the end of the debate now, and I just wanted to go back to the actual original question. What would your recommendation be to non-domestic, business listeners, industrial, commercial, or SME, on the first few steps, sort of no regret, simple steps that they should take to start the journey of decarbonisation? Sorry, I'll go to Matt first.
Right. Well, I guess if you're not using LED technology already, that's a simple step, I guess, to move to LED technology. And I guess the next logical step is to consider some form of control system. So whether you want to leap all the way to controls or you want to make a midway step, that would be, I think, the obvious choice from my perspective. I don't know
I completely agree, and if you're having that first discussion with your designer, your engineer, or your supplier, make certain that they understand what your objectives are. What are you trying to achieve with the light in your space? And minimise the energy. We can do a huge amount to minimise.
Okay, Mervyn, what would you say to start your journey?
I think the first thing you've got to do is understand what you're doing at the moment. You've got to benchmark your own performance. What energy are you using? How are you using it? Are the staff engaged with what you're doing? Do the staff understand why energy can be saved and how it can be best saved? I agree on the control side. Are you getting your access to, do you have controls? Are they properly being used? Have you got the data? You know, you've got meters installed. If you haven't, can you get a better system installed to make sure you understand what you're doing? If you don't benchmark yourself to start with, then that doesn't make the journey very easy because you can't really measure how you're improving over a period of time. So the first step probably is just knowing. I'm not suggesting you go and buy a consultant to do that for you. A lot of that can be done yourself. There are some interesting platforms already being developed that show businesses can do a lot of this themselves, and just get that first step. And then really, yes, just using energy effectively, and the energy, you know, less energy if you can, make it the first fuel. If you have to use it, then just making sure you're using it as effectively as you can and not wasting it. I think that's also important. A lot of stuff's been proven. That I've seen a lot of stories where people have installed equipment and it's never done what it was intended to do, and everyone's assuming it's saving something and it's not. And it's really, that's an important second step. Is when you check what you're doing now, make sure everything you've installed and have got is working properly, and it's the right technology for what, you know, for your needs.
Yes, you've not got CHP systems fighting against air conditioners.
Yes.
Yeah. That's all. James,
not opening the window when you've got your air conditioning on, probably as well.
Right. James, what's your thoughts on the first steps that businesses can take?
So back to my earlier point, buying renewable power does matter. So make a public commitment to buy renewable power. Start to get interested in where your power is actually coming from, and then examine all the different options by which you can buy renewable power. But don't think that it's just a procurement decision. It's a procurement decision that also has indirect benefits and impacts towards, you know, the country reaching net zero goals.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's about time to wrap up now. So don't forget, we have another keynote session, one more today, that's on decarbonisation of transport. And during Net Zero Week, which starts, this is actually the week, so it starts Saturday to Friday next week, we have over 35 free-to-attend live virtual events, all exclusively curated for Net Zero Week and to help you start your journey towards net zero. And I'd like to thank all the sponsors who make it possible, but particularly all three of you panelists and you, the audience, for listening. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye now.
Bye.